Hi, this is Abdul Bharti and welcome to another episode of TFR Insights. And today we have with us Arsalan Farooq, your CEO of Netifi. First of all, thanks for being on the show. But this is our first interaction, so I want to understand a bit about Netifi. What does the company do? What are you guys all about?
Yeah, well, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Swap. So happy to talk about Netifi. At Netifi, we're an open source company that is actually trying to build the next generation platform for cloud native and microservices application development. So we're basically, the Netifi platform is a set of tools and technologies that we've built to enable developers to very quickly build very, very sophisticated distributed cloud-native microservices-based applications. The way to think about this would be, with Kubernetes that a lot of people have used. Kubernetes has solved the problem of containerization and deployment and orchestration of the plumbing of the next generation applications. We're trying to do the same for the actual code that's written and help the developer write distributed applications that will run in those Kubernetes and other infrastructures. So that's our ambition. That's what we're trying to do. And we're trying to sort of complete the picture for the next generation of cloud native applications.
Now, this might sound like kind of a bit off topic, but since I'm talking to you, I want to know your perspective on that. If you look at Kubernetes or all these emerging technologies, and you have been in this field for so long, the early adopters of these technologies are like tech-savvy companies. They want to play with new technologies. But Kubernetes has kind of become, that why not? Everybody's using it, so we should use it too. Which also means that you have to deal with a lot of use cases where one, either Kubernetes was not designed for that use case. Second, those use cases may or may not be, fully prepared for it. So suddenly you are coming across customers who are just coming from everywhere. So I want to understand from you, how has the landscape evolved, as the user base is kind of exploding, and what challenges create for you? Some realistic, some idealistic, some technical, some people. How do you solve it?
Yeah, I think that's a great observation. So, this entire, if I were to just take a step back, the entire change that has happened is from writing big monolithic applications to distributed services or microservices in small components, and that generates a series of problems. So we have, how do you break things up, and how do you deploy those small chunks, and how do you orchestrate those deployments? That's Kubernetes. What we're trying to solve as well. That's great. So now you can deploy it and you can orchestrate it, but how do you write them? How do you write these applications that are inherently distributed? Network-based. That's where companies like Netifi come in. Now, to your point around, just taking Kubernetes, not trying to pick on Kubernetes, but as just an example, you started out with, essentially Kubernetes being deployed and understood only by a small handful of scientists sitting in your little advanced projects area in the enterprise. But now, as that has come out and gotten into broader use, there's been a lot of demand. There's been a lot of pressure on the Kubernetes community to make everything better, basically, configuration better, orchestration better, make it easier to package and deploy, to reduce the configuration overhead. All of those things are a highly dynamic ecosystem that is pushing as the adoption becomes broader and broader. From our perspective, the Kubernetes guys are trying to solve the problem on the infrastructure space, the deployment area and orchestration area, and they're they've got an adoption that is broader than where we are. We're now trying to solve the same set of problems for the developers and the applications guys. So yeah, I think it's going to remain a highly dynamic environment where there's going to be a lot of pressure on producers, the Kubernetes community, the Netifi community, the RSocket community, to make it more and more accessible. So if I were to just summarize, I think the accessibility to the users of Kubernetes and Netifi is where the focus is now, so that we can avail ourselves of all the cool things these things can do.
All of these technologies are open source. So how involved is Netifi not only in the open source community, but how many of your services or products are also open source? How important is open source to you?
Well, it's in our DNA. It's our lifeblood. I mean, so Kubernetes. Just to give you a little bit of sense, one of the key technologies we're trying to drive adoption for in the community, and now are starting to see some great numbers around that, is RSocket, which is an application level network layer protocol that makes distributed computing and distributed programming with reactive paradigm very, very easy. This was created as an open source project by the founding team. The founding team was at Netifi, was at Netflix, and they tried to solve the problem by using an open source approach. So we remain committed at Netifi to continue to push that out, drive awareness, make people know that, hey, this option is here, it's open source. And in addition to that, we're very actively, the way we're doing this, and I know you guys at TFIR covered late last year, the formation of the Reactive Foundation, which is something that we spearheaded the creation of, alongside likes of Facebook and Alibaba and others, to actually give ourselves a platform to drive this not only into open source from a production perspective, but also to drive the awareness and to provide the support to the nascent community that we have. So for us, open source is both a production model, a go-to-market model, and a critical component of bringing this to everyone. I mean, that's kind of the basis of the company.
So if you look at today's cloud native landscape, we talk about microservices, we also talk service mesh, and I will not get into the whole controversy around Istio and Linkerd that is going on there. But so let's stay away from that. But if you look at all these three, how codependent or related they are to, or how much they rely on each other, or can they exist without each other?
I think that's a great question, and I think you're hitting upon a key piece of confusion in the entire next generation cloud native microservices landscape. So here's how we think about it. I'll put in my 2 cents into the debate, and then this is how, when we get asked the question, we respond. So look, cloud native is a production model, right? I mean, how do you write your applications? What kind of libraries and infrastructure components can you rely on, and how do you interface with them? And it's also a deployment model that I'm going to deploy in the cloud. Microservices is an architectural approach. So it's a type of architecture that you build that relies on the various attributes of microservice: distributed, smaller, functionally contained, organizationally aligned chunks of code that turn into microservices. And finally, service mesh is one of the several new technologies that allows you to build, to connect these microservices together, and it's one of many. So you have the deployment model, you have the architectural model, and you have one of the many technologies that you can use to build that architecture using that deployment model. So I think you can see where we're going, which is that they're not mutually exclusive. They, in fact, constitute a stack, so to speak, where you will utilize often all three of them to build your applications. There's admittedly a lot of confusion about this, and I'm hoping this clarifies things a little bit.
So that brings me to the next question, which is that since these technologies are coming, either you call them technologies or buzzword or paradigms, whatever you want to call them, they're coming at such a fast pace. So it becomes hard for users to actually, you cannot dip your toes in everything. So they don't even know where to go. So the thing is, there's at one side, you have new technologies that maybe even your own developers don't know. And then there is the second is education part. So they can very easily go to a vendor, get it, but they don't know which one to use, whether they make sense for us. A lot of customers may ask, should we go cloud native? If yes, why? So can you just talk about how much role does this education play there? And if you do something about it?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think that it's pivotal that people understand, open source is both a blessing and sometimes a curse, because and I say that with all due passion for open source, but the curse, because you can have a proliferation of solutions that overlap or are trying to solve the same set of problems. Because look at how open source works. It works, there's a need, it's unfulfilled, and everyone is empowered to go and address it. And so you have a natural proliferation, which can lead to confusion. And so the education piece is actually twofold. One is, sometimes when a problem is, the more severe the problem is, the more the set of varying solutions open source ecosystems provide. And just to kind of navigate through that is, and find what's right for you, to your point, is you're right. I mean, it's next to impossible for most people to do. People, especially in enterprise settings, just don't have the time or the energy available to wade through as was one of our customers once called it, the zoo. So what I would say is that education is key, and what helps along with that is, you can just wait it out. Some people just wait it out because eventually things do tend to coalesce around a consensus. Let me give you some examples. We remember the LAMP stack. I mean, I'm sure I'm dating myself here, but we had the LAMP stack. Then we had an attempt at something called the SMAC stack. So eventually, what happens is that this constellation of projects, as they go through time and through the period of confusion, eventually coalesce around some sort of a de facto stack or standard, and then things become a little more manageable, so to speak. That said, that doesn't happen just automatically. You mentioned cloud native. The CNCF was an effort to corral all the projects, the Cloud Native Foundation. But unfortunately, what we're finding is that CNCF has now just become this big smorgasbord of projects. And I think a lot of people within the CNCF will agree, and they actually have, I've spoken to them, they say, look, we started out trying to kind of put some structure on some zoological classification on the animal kingdom here, but we ended up just with a massive proliferation. So at the Reactive Foundation, we're taking that seriously. And so one of the things we're trying to do with the Reactive Foundation for this alternative network-based approach to solving the distributed computing problem is to make sure that we guard against as much as we can through a strong governance principle and a good consensus community process to not basically throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak. Yes, education is important, but one has to be careful, and that's, as far as we're concerned, the Reactive Foundation is a place where we're trying to achieve that.
And that also kind of, as we're talking about a lot of users, education, and a lot of these users are also kind of still with their monolithic, versus, so when they look at this microservices approach, they also, as I said, they look at the next signage stuff, they hit all these buzzwords. So first of all, the question is that there are still monolith companies are, trying to move it, but there are companies which are like 200-year-old. There are a lot of banks, which are 100-year-old. There are gas companies which are sold. And then there are a lot of, legacy companies which by design are slow, So first of all, I just want your take on how do you see the adoption of microservices, where they are like kind of, breaking down the monoliths, moving to microservices. What rate do you see? And the second is that what are the reasons where either it's slowing down or why it's not kind of enjoying the kind of growth or adoption you would ideally expect that, hey, yeah, anybody can move it.
Right. I mean, I think there are two important questions I gather from what you've just said. The first one is, look, everyone knows microservices and cloud native, these are the new shiny objects, right? And we all, as technologists and as practitioners, tend to gravitate naturally towards the next shiny object. But I think that there's, despite the fact that myself, our company, we're embedded in trying to enable that and to enable this transformation to the next cloud native microservices-based world, I'll be the first to say that not everything is a nail to the microservices hammer. There are times and there are applications and there are certain use cases where the monolith is just fine. Just go with a monolith and deal with it. I mean, if you have some very tightly written, high performance, you mentioned Wall Street, maybe a financial transactions system, I wouldn't feel compelled to rip that all out. So I think that's, we would caution that, look at the use case, make sure it is a nail. Just because you're holding a hammer, everything should not look like a nail to you. The second thing is, when it comes to why a lot of projects, I think what you're referring to this is increasing data and increasing awareness of the fact that while everyone rushed into, or a set of people rushed into, I want to break everything up, I want to turn it into microservices, a lot of those projects have stalled or are running into some level of difficulty. I mean, one of the studies I was looking at said that, something like 92% of all enterprises have microservices and cloud native projects, and 99% of those projects are reporting critical issues and stalls. And one of the reasons for that is that we're not done building that stack out yet. We are not done building the LAMP stack or the SMAC stack or whatever stack you would like for this. And so there's still that confusion, that tyranny of choice, as we were talking about earlier, around which projects to use, how do you assemble it, how do you cobble everything together. Kubernetes has gone a long way in trying to standardize the infrastructure, the plumbing piece of it, containerization, how do you deploy it? But the top half of that, which is, okay, well, what is going to run inside those containers? How do I write applications that can do, distributed patterns and can be deployed and can be written in a network-centric way? That problem is still in the process of being solved. And, as you know, at Netifi, we're trying to make sure that we contribute to that in a significant way. So I think that the reason is that most people, naturally us included, have jumped into the promise of this incredible new world, but our tools are just catching up. And I think that's what's causing some of the stall and some of the slowdown after the initial rush.
Now let's go back to the service mesh part. As we are moving towards microservices, infrastructure, and they're like, you have to deal with so many services. So what role does service mesh play there? And I will drag you into that controversy if you're willing to. That how do you see the ecosystem evolve? What are the technologies that either you're betting on, or you think CNCF will bet on, or who will be the winner, or there'll be two competing technologies which will continue to coexist?
Yeah. Okay. So, I think that without trying to get myself into too much trouble here, what I would say is that when you look at service mesh, just as with the microservices architecture model, there's a time and a place and a perfect, optimal performance envelope for every approach and every technology. And service mesh is no different. I recently wrote a little bit about the fact that, I see the service mesh as a very innovative solution to a very specific problem. And the specific problem being the fact that we have a bunch of legacy applications that people are trying to break out into microservice, to redeploy in a microservices-based pattern. But these legacy applications, or by legacy, I don't necessarily mean old Fortran stuff. I mean, things like, classic REST Web 2.0 applications that were written in a monolithic stack. People are trying to break that up. But there's very little appetite, of course, to revisit the code. People don't want to rewrite anything or much of anything, right? Because that's just, nobody wants to touch the code. So, there's this no-touch constraint on the code, and the problem still remains, well, how do I break this up and deploy it and emulate kind of a network-based, network-centric behavior? And the service mesh is a response to that. A service mesh allows you to come in and say, look, I'm going to slap a proxy underneath everything, and I'm just going to make sure that you don't have to rewrite your applications. We'll just make them look like they're actually going through the networking model, which I think is excellent, and it serves a role. And if the problem you're faced with is you have a fixed or rigid architecture, or you have other constraints, you can't change your code, you can't rewrite anything, you can't even, in some cases, even touch anything, service mesh is the place to go to disaggregate your monolith. But that's not the whole story. One of the things that is important is the other side of this. What about the applications where you can touch code? What about the new stuff you're writing? What about the next 5 years of your architecture and your application development? There, you no longer have the concern of, well, I wrote this in the Web 2.0 REST model. I need a service mesh. There you can have a lot more capable technologies and many more options available. And that's part of where our socket and what we're trying to do is getting built too. So service mesh is a response to a very specific problem in the industry, and it's a brilliant response. It has a very it has a thriving ecosystem, and that's where some of the battles you were referring to, Linkerd, Istio, this, that, all the, Kuma, I mean, they're control planes coming out of the woodwork these days, all of that stuff is happening. It just points to me that they're onto the right problem, which is how do I take my old stuff and redeploy? And there's a lot of excitement and activity around this. But once if you move away from that and behind that curtain is the next problem, which is how do I write new applications? And that's where some of the technologies and the work that Reactive Foundation is doing and some of the thought leadership we're doing is going to be key. And then that's I think the way the landscape's going to break down.
Right. Let's just talk about RSocket for a while, as we talked about other competing technologies which are there. So are there other competing technologies that compete with RSocket? If they are there, what gives you an edge or advantage over them with RSocket?
Well, I think, RSocket is an open source technology, and it is one of the key founding projects of the Reactive Foundation. And it is something that, is being used at Facebook and at Alibaba and Netflix and a bunch of other places. We're not trying to compete really with anyone. We're basically saying, look, we know a few things about how you want to write the next generation of your applications and how you want to design the next generation of your application architecture, right? We know, for example, and there's a wide consensus on this in the industry and amongst the community, the developer community, the architectural community, that reactive programming, the reactive paradigm has to be there. Things like back pressure, flow control, cancellations. There's a laundry list of things that we know that we need to build these next generation applications. And so the question is, let's put out projects. Let's put something out that will actually provide those needs, will meet those needs. RSocket is just, in our view, was one of the first out the gate as a project and an application level networking protocol, taking a very inclusive protocol-centric view of the problem. And I'm happy to report that, even since the last time we talked, we're looking at the metrics, and it really looks like RSocket is starting to take hold. We are quadrupling our downloads from our open source repositories on every quarter. We're tripling the GitHub stars. So there's a sense, and then we have these big deployments. So to your point, I think competitively, it's less about are there other technologies, etc. It's more like there's a huge white space. There's a need, there's a gap in the market that's coming up for the next generation of applications and architectures. And RSocket right now is just one of the first movers that has some real traction as a project and a real community process, and now a foundation that is going to help us hopefully make it succeed.
If you look at the foundation of the company and then foundation of a foundation, Reactive Foundation under you, how is the company itself evolving? Can you talk about, either some of the use cases or who is, because you are working on an open source project, but you're also commercializing it. So can you talk about that?
Yeah, sure, of course. So, as we've been talking about, that right now we're in the phase of the company where we are just pushing and making sure that education, that open source community process, that foundation, all of that stuff is happening, to driving awareness. So we're kind of trying to spearhead that awareness with our partners, Facebook and Alibaba and others. The commercial part of this is that, as this happens, we're also building a set of tools, commercial tools that we are, that anybody who adopts in an enterprise setting, something like RSocket, something like these kind of reactive technologies will need. It tends to be the boring stuff, the security, the auditing, all the other table ante for something to become a viable enterprise platform. So that's the stuff that we're adding on to the open source project, and that's going to be our offering as people start deploying it in the enterprise setting. For the open source setting, I mean, this is not some sort of a bait and switch operation. We hope that people will continue to use the open source stuff. We have a community edition that's out there, fully functional. People can use it, build fantastic applications around it, tell other people about it. But for enterprises, we'll have some dedicated enterprise features, and that's where our sort of go-to-market and business model comes from.
How do you see, all these technologies, especially in the service mesh space, in 2020? Because things change quickly, but you also see adoption. So we have reached this, where a lot of consolidation is also happening. So we have kind of, reached the stage, and now the industry is moving in a different phase. So from your perspective, where do you see things will be heading in 2020?
Yeah, so I'm a famously failed prognosticator. But I'll attempt anyway. I think that there are going to be three key things we're going to see on the service mesh axis. I think that as we have recently seen, there's a proliferation of different types of approaches. You've got the old Istio stuff. You've got the Linkerd, Envoy from a proxy perspective, sidecar perspective. We've seen Kuma. We've seen a bunch of other things. I think that 2020 is going to continue to be a year of proliferation of these various types of solutions. Somebody asked me recently, do we think that the consolidation phase or that consensus into a stack phase is going to happen in 2020? I think there's still some distance to go before we get there. So I think that's one thing unfortunately, it's just basically we're going to continue seeing this thing proliferate. The second thing I would say is that we're already starting to see a second order understanding of what it means to think about transitioning to a microservices and cloud native thing. So we're kind of coming to the end of all the new shiny stuff, and the next order of realization is starting to emerge. I'm starting to be in conversation, participate in conversations, and I go out a lot and talk and give talks, etc. And I'm getting a lot of feedback where people saying, what, we need to pull back because some of the warts on this entire thing are starting to become visible. People are starting to realize that microservices are not let me just deploy Kubernetes, let me deploy service mesh, and I have microservices. That's not how it's working. There are scale problems, there are performance problems, complexity problems, choice problems, a lot of other stuff. So I think that in 2020 is the year where people will say, okay, you know what, maybe we need to pull back a little bit and see whether we really need to break everything up. And the second thing is, if we do, what are the types of technologies, et cetera, that we should use, and how does that relate to our next 5 or 10 years? Which is the picture that we're trying to conclude. And the third thing that we're going to see, I think, is going to be, and this is a little bit of kind of a curiosity, the third thing, but I do think that when it comes to distributed network-based applications, the programming and the deployment technologies, there are a couple of macroscopic trends that I am very curious to see what happens to. So you've got things like 5G, you've got a bunch of other interesting database and other technologies that are coming down the pike, and I'm curious to see how they will coalesce to inform our microservices and cloud native topologies. So those are the three things. I think two are prognostications, and one is just kind of curiosity of mine. But that's something that I'll be looking for in 2020.
Arsalan, once again, thanks for taking your time out and talking to me today. And I look forward to talking to you again. Maybe at some point in person. But looking at coronavirus, I don't think that we'll be traveling anytime soon. So we'll try to resume this, online discussion once more. Thank you.
Okay, you're most welcome. It was my pleasure, and I look forward to talking again.